All right, we've been looking at inventions and the way those inventions changed American society and culture. Well, we're going to continue looking at inventions, but we're instead just going to look at one specific one, and that's going to be railroads. Now, from the mid to late 1860s through the 1900s, you could really consider this the age of railroads because they're going to have a huge impact on pretty much every aspect of American life and culture, not just the transportation of equipment and cargo and stuff like that, but also transportation of passengers. Now, railroads actually gave us the ability to span both time and space. Now, the space thing, that's pretty easy to understand. You know, railroad goes from point A to point B. It covers a specific distance and whatnot. You know, that's pretty clear cut. The time thing is a little bit different. Because of railroads, because of the interconnectivity that we were able to now have between towns, we really were going to have to change the way we looked at time. Now, we're going to look at a national network. Now, there had been for years and years past dozens, hundreds of different railroads throughout the United States. Now, some of these were very short line, they did not go very far, others were regional, some went quite a distance, but none of them actually spanned the entire nation. And that's what we were trying to do. We wanted to set up some kind of a rail link that would cover everything from, say, New York all the way to San Francisco. We wanted one that would be transcontinental. And that transcontinental railroad was actually finished May 10th, 1869. I mean, we're looking at just 4 years after the end of the Civil War, we actually completed the Transcontinental Railroad. You had two rail lines. You had the Central Pacific starting in Sacramento and heading east, plus you had the Union Pacific starting in Omaha, Nebraska and heading west. And the idea was to have the two rail lines link up somewhere in the middle, and that would therefore create the Transcontinental Railroad. Well, this was completed May 10th, 1869. Now, this is a picture of the day where they drove the ceremonial gold spike. There was an actual honest-to-goodness gold spike. It was tapped in with a silver hammer into a special piece of wood, that had already been, pre-drilled. This was not like the normal guys driving spikes into the wood to hold the rails down. No, this was very ceremonial and whatnot. In fact, the wood and the golden spike itself would later be removed shortly thereafter to make sure that they weren't stolen. Here you can see work crews from both lines where they came together. You've got two trains, one from each side, basically nose to nose. And there was somewhere between 300 to 3,000 people at this. We don't really have specific records. And this all took place at a spot called Promontory, Utah. This is where, after laying thousands of miles of track, all the train lines finally had one set point where they were connected to one another from coast to coast. Now, trains brought both a sense of romance to the world, and there was some harsh realities that went along with it. Okay, so you have both the romance and the reality of the train. Okay, now, for example, it brought the dream of available land, adventure, a fresh start. Land, the further west you went, was more and more plentiful and available. It was also a lot cheaper, and so people kept going west to try and get that available land. It was an adventure or a fresh start because regardless of what had gone on back east, you could literally, pick up your stuff, get on a train, and head west. We now, instead of it taking up to 6 months to get from New York to San Francisco, it could take as little as 6 or 7 days. Beforehand, you used to have to get on a boat, go all the way around South America and come back north, or you did a combination of trains and covered wagons. Now you could get that fresh start in a week or so. And so there were a lot of people who wanted to take part in this. They wanted that ability to live the American dream. Now, the construction of the railroad was neither cheap nor simple. It did involve a sizable portion of both Chinese and Irish immigrants. In fact, for the building of the line from Sacramento east, it was actually cheaper to hire workers in China, bring them across the Pacific and put them to work than it was to hire workers in, say, New York and get them over to Sacramento and start from there. And so you had immigrants from China working on the railroad, you had immigrants from Ireland working on the railroad, you had a large number of Civil War veterans were working on the railroads at this time. And as a result, this was a pretty sizable workforce going through trying very hard to build this transcontinental line. And while this did allow for a lot of job opportunities, you got to take into account it was not the safest work possible. Throughout the course of building this railroad, you got to think that in any major construction project, especially one going through things like the Sierra Nevada mountains, you're going to have some hardships and some difficulties. And grand total, we're looking at about 2,000 employees were killed and about 20,000 were injured. Now, some of these were just through the normal, what you would expect working in those conditions. There were landslides, rock falls, things along those lines. But you also had to take into account that for, cutting the paths and whatnot, they were using nitroglycerin. And nitroglycerin is exceedingly volatile and would actually cause a great deal of damage. So you have to take into account not just those things, regular, workplace accidents, but you also have to take into account that going from Omaha west, you also had a number of different Indian attacks. So you had about 2,000 employees were killed and about 20,000 injured over the course of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. It was not a cheap endeavor either in the cash money necessary nor in the lives lost as a result. Now, one other thing that had to change at this point came to be thought of in terms of railroad time. Okay, now we all know today, you can think about the United States, or at least the continental United States, we have 4 basic time zones, Pacific, Mountain, Central, and Eastern. But that wasn't the case back then. Believe it or not, each town quite literally had its own time zone. Noon was whenever the sun was directly overhead. And you can think about it this way, okay? Let's say it is noon in Ripon, California. Okay, the sun is directly overhead at that moment. Well, take Oakdale. Okay, Oakdale is east of us. The sun was overhead prior to when it was here, so they're off by a little bit. Well, go further west. Let's head over to, say, Oakland. And in Oakland, you got, it's going to be a little bit later. These essentially are how each town did their own time. And you think about it, it didn't really have that big of an impact because the time necessary to move from one town to another, or just transport yourself from one town to another, basically meant that you didn't really notice these things. Well, let me give you an example. Okay, now I have a thing showing the time zones at the time. Now let's just look at the one on the right. Okay, that's going to be the one where it says Boston in the center of it. Okay, it's 12 noon in Boston. Okay, it is a few hundred miles to get to New York City from Boston. But if it's 12 noon in Boston, you can see right up there at the top at the 12 o'clock position, it would be 11:48 in New York. Now today, they're all in the same time zone. So we would all just assume that noon in Boston is noon in New York. Well, that wouldn't be the case. And you go over one, Albany, New York. Okay, now those are just 2 towns within New York State, but there's a 2-minute difference between when noon is. You go over to, let's say, the 3 o'clock position. Okay, it says Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, when it's noon in Boston, would be 11:24 in Pittsburgh, and in Philadelphia, 11:44. 2 towns, same state, 20-minute difference. So you can see that a train could depart Boston for New York, travel, X amount of time, and it'd be a totally different time than it got there. It wouldn't be, say it took 2 hours to get there by train. When they arrived, it wasn't exactly 2 hours from when they had left. Okay, so it's going to be confusing to try and schedule things. But that was the way time was set up. Each town had its own. Now, there was a guy by the name of C.F. Dowd. Now, he proposed that the Earth be divided into 24 distinct time zones. Okay, now that made perfect sense. You think about it. Here we are, we've got a planet. It takes 24 hours for us to turn all the way around. So you divide it into 24 zones. Okay, the world got on board with this. This is a world in which you're now seeing faster communication, transportation, things like that. And as such, time is becoming different, and we need to work with that. Now, the US, just like today, would have 4 time zones. This is long before we had Alaska or Hawaii as states, and as such, we're going to go through and just have the 4 time zones. And so it was November 18th, 1883. Railroad crews, towns across the country, for the first time ever, all synchronized their watches. For the first time ever, every town within a certain time zone would be on the same hour and minute. Every person across the country would now be on the same minute as everybody else. It no longer mattered exactly when noon was, when the sun was directly overhead in your specific town. We now had a sort of one-size-fits-all as far as time goes. We synchronized our watches, and we went forward from there. Railroads had required us to rethink how we were looking at time, and we're still using that information to this very day.